Yes, on either side of me. You can come right here. You got it. So Ariana, this is Melissa, who I mentioned last night, who works on
AI and Social Security?
That's right.
Cool. Very cool. Well, I'm glad you're here.
Yes, I'm glad I'm here too.
Yeah, so I was just saying, I mean, Ariana was mentioning that she does a lot of work and has connections
Mm-hmm.
in that space.
Okay.
So I just thought it might be hopeful to connect you a little bit. And,
Yeah, absolutely.
And at least get your information and be in touch.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yes.
Awesome. You're fine sitting there. So are you good?
Yeah. Are you okay?
Yeah. How's the work going?
Mm.
It's going. Sorry, I haven't. I was supposed to send you that chapter we talked about with my comments. I haven't done that yet. I'm sure you have enough work
Yeah.
already. I have it. It's just I have to put it into.
That's all I hear.
Yeah, Daniel was supposed to have stuff for me today too, and
This is a rough time of the year because everyone's sending stuff all at once.
yeah, I'm not too. It's all good.
Yeah.
Whenever he can.
Aboulafia.
What's the origins of that name?
I'm supportive Jewish. So we are Turkish.
Okay.
Both sides of my family are from Izmir.
Oh, okay.
And before that, Spain. But the Jews were.
Yeah, my father's family from Turkey.
Which part?
From Istanbul.
Okay.
Yeah.
So probably also
Same deal.
Spain.
Yep.
Yes.
So
you're are you quarter Samoan?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how do you measure these things? Yes, I have.
It's hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard.
So yeah, both my grandparents on my father's side.
Cool. Do you do any of the Sephardic like Passover tradition? No.
I don't do anything.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was gonna say if you follow the Sephardic tradition, you eat rice
Yeah.
for Passover. So if you're better than it.
Yeah, we don't. I mean, my aunt used to Sephardic foods, but yeah, it didn't pass down to my generation. But
The Sephardic food is so good.
yeah, much better than Eastern European. Ashkenazi food,
They have
which is
some.
the other side of my family.
They have some bangers.
Yeah. Yeah.
White fish,
No.
bagel lock.
What's that? Bagels. You got me there.
You're not a Kiddush fan?
Kisses are okay.
Oh,
I like them okay. I wouldn't call them bangers.
You ready? Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started for today. So today we have Ariana Aboulafia coming in from the Center for Democracy and Technology. And to introduce you, we have Damian Williams.
Hello, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay? Fantastic. Good afternoon. Very happy to be back with the Virginia Tech STS community, even virtually. For those of you who don't already know me, my name is Damian Patrick Williams, graduating class of 2022. I'm here today to introduce you to somebody who I very much admire and respect. Ariana H. Aboulafia currently leads the Disability Rights and Technology Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. Her work there focuses on how people with disabilities are impacted by AI and other technologies, and I am also extremely fortunate to act as a member of the advisory board for that panel with Ariana. She was first introduced to technology policy while serving as a fellow to the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative and later worked as an assistant public defender in Miami Dade County. Ariana is a deeply dedicated advocate, policymaker, organizer, leader in the fight for the rights, access, and needs of disabled people at their many and varied intersections with technology. She's worked with community and governmental organizations like the American Association for People with Disabilities, the U.S. Access Board, New Disabled South, the New York Bar Association, and many, many more. Ariana's work consistently centers disabled people's perspectives and lived experiences of technology and has had massive impact on various local, state, and federal policies, as well as public opinion and general understanding of the needs of disabled people and the impacts and implications of technology on all of our daily lives. She's joining us today to present Centering People with Disabilities in Tech Policy, and it is my profound honor to introduce Ariana Aboulafia.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes. Damian, thank you. Thank you, my friend. I want to tell you, Damian, that I stood up in the middle of that so I could stand up here because there's 6 TVs in here, so I could see your face 6 times, which is like I'm surrounded by Damian. That was very, very kind of you. I am equally honored to have Damian on my advisory committee to work with someone who is so insightful and so dedicated to doing the right thing all the time. And I've learned so very much from you. So when I found out that you were introing me, I was very pleased. So hi, everyone. My name is Ariana. As Damian said, I'm an attorney. I currently lead the Disability Rights and Tech Policy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm going to start kind of by giving a little intro of myself and the work I do, and then I'll sort of talk a little bit about what else we're going to cover today. The thing I'll say at the outright is that I'm hoping that we can have more of a conversation. So if y'all have questions, if there's anything I talk about that you are interested in, that you want to learn more about, or there's something I'm not talking about and you want to know why I'm not talking about it, or you want to talk about it, please bring it up. I'm going to try to leave, I think, maybe like 20-ish minutes, maybe more, for a Q&A at the end, which means I'm going to give you a lot of information, and then I want us to talk about it. So I'm hoping that y'all will be down to do that with me, because I want this to be responsive to kind of what you're interested in and what you want to learn. So this is me. I came from DC. CDT is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we sort of focus on tech policy, but through the lens of civil rights. My work specifically focuses on tech policy through the lens of disability rights and justice. So what we're going to talk about today, sort of what it means to center people with disabilities in tech policy, some foundational issues that contribute to some of the discriminatory outcomes that we see for folks with disabilities when they interact with tech, including issues centering disability data. We're going to talk about what it means to build a disability-inclusive AI ecosystem. And then I'm going to give a little, an example of some of the work that I do and talk about a project I did prior to the 2024 election where we asked a bunch of chatbots questions about voting with a disability and saw how the quality of the information. So the purpose here, again, is kind of to give a background on like what this work looks like, right? What does it mean to think about people with disabilities and tech outside of the lens of digital accessibility, right? What does it mean to think about accessibility, building a product that we can use as a floor, and thinking about all the myriad of other ways that people with disabilities interact with technology and may be discriminated against by technology. And I typically use the term like quote unquote emerging technologies, and that generally includes like AI and algorithmic systems. And so we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about data issues, how that plays a role, and then sort of the policy work, the organizing work of building a better AI ecosystem and what that looks like. So, start here. So, what does it mean, right, when I say centering people with disabilities in tech policy? And that question is also like, so what do you do, right? So what I mean by this is ensuring that people with disabilities, and my work is cross-disability in nature, so meaning that I try to provide sort of policy solutions that work for people with all disabilities. I tend to focus quite a bit on multiply marginalized people with disabilities and how they interact with tech and with systems. So by that I mean disabled people of color, disabled queer people, disabled trans people, et cetera. But when I say centering people with disabilities, it means in development, in procurement, in auditing, basically in every step of creating a technology, procuring it, deploying it, auditing it later. People with disabilities should be not included, necessarily centered, right? And there's a difference between those two things. Something I say a lot about tech design is like we want to really avoid tokenism of people with disabilities, right? Something I've been saying recently, because I think it's a banger, is like there's a difference between co-design and co-sign, right? And so what I mean by that is that when tech companies or startups or people who are building assistive technology, right, when they say like, oh, well, we co-design with the disability community, are you co-designing or are you looking for a co-signer, right? Are you just looking for a person with a disability to tell you everything you're doing is right? Or are you really interested in what we have to say across disability, across systems? And it extends not only to technology, to the building of it, but to tech policy, right? Because policy is the thing that regulates tech, in theory. And so it's really important that people with disabilities be centered not just in the tech side of things, but in the policy and the regulation and the law side of it as well. So I use this term tech-facilitated disability discrimination. And what I mean by that is that, you know, folks with disabilities have been experiencing discrimination in essentially every system that you can think of: education, voting, employment, benefits determinations and benefits deployment, pretty much across the board, any system you can think of. People with disabilities have experienced discrimination. The technology is facilitating that discrimination. In a lot of ways, it is making it worse. It is not that the discrimination that people with disabilities are seeing is inherently new, right? And so one of the interesting things about a lot of the work that I do is that I make arguments that both from a legal perspective, so we have fairly strong disability rights infrastructure from a legal perspective in the United States, but also from an organizing perspective, that people with disabilities in fact do have some method of recourse for addressing the worst tech-based harms or risks because of the infrastructure that we have, and because the discriminatory risks are not inherently new, they just feel kind of different. And the reason they feel kind of different is because we're deploying AI tools into systems that are already not working for disabled people, right? The healthcare system, the education system, the hiring system, and employment. These are systems that already see significantly high rates for discrimination for people with disabilities. They're already not working that well. And what happens when you deploy AI into these systems a lot of times is that the AI serves as a force multiplier, and it makes things worse instead of making things better. And a better use of AI would be to make things better. So this is just sort of a basic thought as to like what are the goals of the work that I do and the goals of the project, and then sort of how we do it. So I work with tech policy organizations to help them incorporate disability into their work. I work quite a bit, I do quite a bit of organizing with disability rights and justice groups to help them identify opportunities to engage on these issues of tech policy. And a lot of times what you see in the tech space is a lack of expertise in disability. You don't see a lack of expertise in tech very much in disability spaces, but you see a lack of resources. And there are a myriad of reasons as to why disability rights and justice organizations are underfunded and under-resourced. I pretty much always want to sort of spark a dialogue. I hope that you leave this today thinking about something new, and that's also why I want to spend some time talking and responding directly. And so the question is sort of, how do we do this? So I think about my work in sort of like a few different pillars. So one is a lot of research. So that's research reports, briefs, and op-eds. One of the sort of pillars is building a community of practice. So I tend to always have an intern who works with me, who can sort of then go back into their school and tell people about this field of work. I give a lot of talks to students. I'm very lucky to be able to do that. Direct advocacy with state and federal policymakers, that's my other sort of vertical, and then serving as a resource to leaders in tech policy, disability policy, and civil society. And then you could think of another one, which is like media, talking to reporters, but that's also sort of just getting the word out. So my days are never the same. I do something different really every moment, and I'm engaging on all sorts of different issues. So here are some examples of some of the things that I work on. So under the field of economic security and equitable employment, so thinking about things like tenant screening algorithms and how if a disabled person is applying for a job, for an apartment, let's say, right, and they have medical debt, how a tenant screening algorithm may be weighing medical debt and using that to deny a person with a disability access to housing, right? Hiring assessments and personality tests. I've done quite a bit of work here. So when people with disabilities people with and without disabilities, when you're applying to jobs, you may be interacting with hiring tools. And that could be something like an algorithmic resume screener that sort of uses, let's say, a large language model like ChatGPT to weigh which resumes get on to the next step. And in 2024, the University of Washington did some research on this and found that when you plugged into the LLM two similar, exact same resumes, other than one had disability-related honors and scholarships, that it downranked and downweighed the resumes that had disability-related honors and scholarships, right? So that's a way that a hiring tool could discriminate against people with disabilities. And we've done a lot. We did a qualitative research study on this last year, specifically on personality tests. Use of algorithmic systems in public benefits. So in places like Arkansas, where we saw an algorithmic tool that was being used to determine benefits and led to the cutting of benefits for a lot of people who needed home and community-based services. And my friend Kevin DeLebon at Tectonic Justice took that case several years ago. So that's sort of like thinking about it through the lens of economic security and employment. Privacy. So I do a lot of work on arguing that assistive technologies should be more privacy protected, that we should think about privacy for disabled people as a core value of inclusive design, that disabled people should be able to use assistive technologies without giving up sensitive data, whether that's location data, biometrics, that sort of thing. Free expression and misinformation. This is one of my personal favorites. Thinking about content moderation, and I've written about the content moderation update that Meta made, as an example, right after the presidential inauguration last year, and how that could impact disabled people and the ways in which they interact with tech. Misinformation from chatbots, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. How that affects the information integrity environment, how that could impact the ability of a person with a disability to vote. I do a lot on Education, so thinking about exam proctoring software and how that could potentially flag a person with a disability for cheating when they're not. I recently put out a report on the legal implications of using AI to build out individualized education programs for disabled students. And then doing some work, let's say in the criminal legal system, law enforcement side, what it looks like when judges are using algorithms to make determinations as to pretrial detention or recidivism risk. And the reason I spent a couple minutes on this slide is because the most actually important thing that I want to get forward to folks is that this is impacting us in every single area of our lives. We are far past the point where someone can say, I don't want to use AI, and so therefore AI will not impact me. And I was telling a story at lunch about my sister, who I love very, very dearly, and who calls ChatGPT the robot, and her whole thing is, don't use that robot. You cannot want to use the robot, but also it's so integrated into every single other aspect of your life that you are going to interact with it, right? And so it's important that we understand what the risks are. I'm gonna move through some of this. So, questions on data. So this is everywhere, right? These tools are everywhere, and that's one reason why there are so many issues. But the other reason why there are so many issues is sort of due to what I consider to be an inherent incompatibility between how AI and algorithmic tools work and our data practices of gathering inclusive data. So generally speaking, the way that AI and algorithmic tools work is they create outputs based on inputs, right? So think about ChatGPT as an example. You give it a prompt and it gives you something in return. Whether that thing is right or not is a different conversation, but you give it something and it gives you something, right? It is giving you that thing, that output, not just based on your prompt. It's getting the answer from somewhere, right? And really where it's getting that information from is the data set that it's been trained on. So data sets that are used to train systems are often not inclusive of people with disabilities. And so there are issues with data collection, as an example, right? Are they getting enough information about people with disabilities? Are they accounting for stigma? Are their data collection practices accessible? Are they in plain language? Are they trying to get information in ways that are compatible with screen readers? When they're asking questions about disability, are they defining disability in a way that someone would know how to respond to it? Because there's a lot of different ways to define disability. And so I wrote this piece 2 years ago now for, that I published for the anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I wrote it with my colleague who leads our AI governance lab, Miranda Bogan, and Bonnie Sweenor, who is an absolute genius on disability data, and she works at Johns Hopkins. And sort of our idea here, and this is a graphic that says, to reduce disability bias in technology, start with disability data. And that's the title of a report that I wrote, I think it was in 2024. And sort of the idea here was to think about, if we were to inclusively design an AI system, the first thing you would need to start with is getting better data on disability and thinking about sort of how to do that. And so these were some of the recommendations in that report, and I'm gonna go through it, but decently quickly. And so we argued that disability data should be collected in all other contexts where other demographic data is collected. And the interesting thing about this is thinking about disability as part of demographics, right? As opposed to thinking about it from a medical perspective or something else, right? We recommended that data be collected and stored in ways that are respectful of personal and data privacy. Because one of the big concerns from folks in the disability community, even if you were to say, you know, this is the way or one of many ways to get more inclusive algorithmic tools and AI tools, there are still concerns about personal and data privacy, and for good reason, right? Because some of this information is quite sensitive. And so it's one thing to say, you know, better algorithmic tools require more data. I don't necessarily think that the more data is always better is the answer here, but more data in ways that are intentional and that are privacy protective can be incorporated into inclusive design, if you're thinking about inclusive design as a important part of building out an algorithmic tool or an AI system. We recommended that people think more inclusively about how to define disability, how to collect disability data, that people have a growth mindset and think about what it means to collect disability data. And here as well, right, as in pretty much all of my recommendations, that we center people with disabilities in all of these things. This is something I say a lot. Disabled people, we are experts not just in disability, but in whatever it is that we do, right? I think a lot of times folks with disabilities are presumed to be experts in disability, which we may or may not be, right? Just because someone has a disability doesn't mean they're an expert in disability studies, as an example, right? But people with disabilities, we are the ones who should be creating these tools that work for us, but also with an elevation of our own expertise, whether we're coders or technologists or lawyers or policymakers or whatever it is. We are the experts in ourselves, but we're also the experts in whatever it is we're the expert in. And we also recommended just thinking a little bit about accessibility, which doesn't necessarily happen all the time. So there is sort of those foundational issues, right? And thinking about, okay, you know, we have these concerns with people with disabilities that are interacting with tech in pretty much every system, right? The integration of AI is never neutral. It is always impacting marginalized people in one way or the other, oftentimes in a way that's discriminatory. And so then we think about, right, okay, why is that? Why is that happening? That's happening from a foundational perspective because there are issues with data. So now we think about what does it look like to build a better world, right? What would it look like to build a more inclusive AI ecosystem for people with disabilities? And I wrote this alongside my friend Henry Claypool at the American Association of People with Disabilities. And we released this last year. I cannot recall when. And sort of the framing of this report, again, is like it's about building a better tomorrow, but it's also about sort of what would it look like if we said that we can maximize benefits and minimize harms or risks of emerging technologies for people with disabilities. And one of the reasons we wanted to focus on that framing was that people with disabilities are oftentimes being used as a solely positive use case for emerging technologies, right? So what you see a lot is, and I call them the startup bros, is like you will see someone who wants to build a technology because they genuinely want to help people with disabilities without asking us if we need help, which is like the foundational question, right? Because the answer might be no. Then secondarily asking if that method is the best way without centering people in the design, in the even initial thought process behind any of it, right? And they will put out a technology and say, I did it, right? I helped people with disabilities. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Because it may be trying to solve a problem that we don't have. It may not solve a problem the right way because we weren't properly included in it. But also it may be actively harmful, right? And hiring tools are a good example of that. There are hiring tools that are used, and part of the marketing for them is, well, these tools are tested for bias. They're less discriminatory. They're tested for bias. They're not often tested for disability bias, right? And so you have someone who is let's say a good faith employer that says, I want to use this tool because it's tested for bias. It'll make my hiring practices more equitable. And in fact, it may be discriminating against people with disabilities. It may be inaccessible to people with disabilities. And because it's been marketed as bias tested, it's actually more difficult for people with disabilities to make those arguments that they may be facing employment discrimination, right? And so we wanted to focus this idea on like, what would it look like to say? Because I don't say, as an example, like a person with a disability should never use X technology, right? But I do believe that certain technologies have more privacy trade-offs than are necessary. I think lots of technologies could be designed better. And I do think that raising the awareness of the ways in which these tools not only can be useful for things like independent living, but also how they can be harmful, helps us all make more informed decisions. And informed decision making is part of disability justice and part of independent living. So we talked about this from a perspective both of stakeholders and of systems. So in thinking about if you were to build a better world, right, build a disability inclusive AI ecosystem, who would you want to talk to? You want to talk to disabled people. You want to talk to disability rights and justice advocates. You want to talk to the government, agencies. You want to talk to private sector AI practitioners, so developers, tech companies. And what systems would you focus on? And so we focused on employment, education, government benefits, information and communications technology, mostly assistive tech, healthcare, transportation, and the criminal legal system. And again, right, this is sort of an example of how widespread this work is because of how widespread these tools are, right? They are just absolutely everywhere. And it's really important to build a sort of cross-systems coalition in all of this work to raise the awareness, but also to get people sort of activated and motivated on it. Okay, so now we're gonna get into the fun stuff. So I'm gonna give an example. This is one of my favorite projects that I have done at CDT thus far. And yes, we did in fact put it out right before the election in 2024. And so this is a photo of a graphic, and it's the graphic from a brief that we published. And it's called Generating Confusion, Stress Testing AI Chatbot Responses on Voting with a Disability. And so before I get into sort of what this is, I want to talk a little bit about why I wanted to study it. The idea that I had was that I was very interested in the information integrity environment for people with disabilities online. And what I mean by that is I was interested in the ways that misinformation, so information that is wrong but not necessarily wrong on purpose, because that would be disinformation, how it could impact the abilities of people with disabilities to do things. We focused on voting because voting in the United States is terribly, terribly complicated. The rules on what accommodations, what accessibility looks like for voters with disabilities, they vary very significantly on a state-by-state basis. And voting with a disability is just terribly confusing. And it gets more confusing every day, honestly. This is not getting easier. And with all of the sort of conflicting information out there, and CDT has an elections team, so I happen to have some elections experts that I was working with, we wanted to see if a person with a disability who was rightfully like, okay, what are the rules here? How can I vote, when, where? Were to ask 5 major chatbots, would that information be of good quality? And if not, would it impact their ability to vote? Because voting is so important, right? It's a sort of bastion of democracy. And if chatbots are playing a role there, and they can play a better one, I thought it was important to figure that out. So, moved on to the next slide here. As a general matter too, and I didn't already mention this, but as a general matter, voting procedures vary by state. They're particularly confusing for people with disabilities, but as a general matter, they vary based on state by state. So we tested 5 major chatbots. We tested Mistral, which is owned by Mistral, that's a French company. Gemini 1.5 Pro, which is owned by Google. GPT-4, and GPT-4 is no longer, but that was the most up-to-date model at the time. That one is owned by OpenAI. Claude 3 Opus, which is owned by Anthropic. Some of you may have heard about Anthropic in the news recently. They've been there. And Llama, which is owned by Meta. Meta is the company that owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp. And we wanted to ask them a bunch of questions about voting with a disability. And actually, before I get to the results, To my knowledge, there has never been a study that is this large on voting, questions related to voting with a disability and asking chatbots. We asked 78 questions, so 78 times 5 responses for each chatbot, and then we went through them all with a fine-tooth comb and ranked them based on accuracy. So this was a labor of love in advance of an election. But here were some of the responses. 61% of responses, so that's the majority, had at least one type of insufficiency. So we rated insufficiencies, right, like did it answer the question or not? When it sent me a link, was the link broken, right? Because that would be insufficient. Over 1/3 of the answers included incorrect information. This was an interesting one because it's difficult to rank exactly how important incorrect information is. So we said, this can range, but some of it is egregious misinformation, like incorrect voter registration deadlines or false claims about the availability of accessible voting options like curbside voting. Every model hallucinated at least once. So a hallucination in the context of a chatbot basically means like they provide you information that's totally wrong out of nowhere. And so it made up a law, which I thought was funny. It created a voting machine, and it created a disability rights organization, and none of those exist. And one of the interesting things about the hallucinations of these chatbots is that for me, and I tell this story pretty frequently, for me, the hallucinations of these chatbots and doing this project really illustrated one of the more important, I think, sociological phenomenons that come into play when we're dealing with AI and algorithms, which is called automation bias. And automation bias basically means that people have a tendency to defer to something that comes from a machine, an algorithm, an AI tool, etc. And automation bias is part of the explanation as to why sort of this idea of like, just have a human in the loop. And if you do some human oversight, then everything will be fine. That doesn't necessarily work all the time, right? Because first of all, you'd have to have the right human, you'd have to have them in the right space and the loop, right? What does it mean to have a human in the loop when you're thinking about reviewing AI outputs? But also that person would have to be really aware of their biases and how their biases may lead to them deferring to a chatbot even when it's wrong. And so I tell this story because I'm going to tell on myself here. I know more about this than the average person. And I was with an expert in elections, and it had the chatbot, I believe it was GPT, had told me something pursuant to this statute. And I was like, I've never heard of that in my entire life. What is this statute? And I remember it to this, the Military Postal Voting Act. And I was like, is this like a nickname? What is happening here, right? And I looked it up myself. I did a search, no results, nothing comes back. And I'm thinking to myself, I think this is a hallucination because I know what hallucinations are. I know that hallucinations are an inherent part of using LLMs. I know voting law-ish. And I'm thinking to myself, I think this is a hallucination. But the automation bias kicks in and I'm like, is it though, right? And I asked 3 other people who also did their own searches before I felt comfortable calling it a hallucination, right? And that's that I know it hallucinates. I know that I have a bias towards it. And still, before I felt comfortable writing down that this was a hallucination, there was 2 elections experts, me and one of our experts in statistics. And I was sitting around a table being like, everyone needs to check, right? That's how strong that bias is, that even if you're aware of it, it makes sort of human oversight very difficult. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about some of the results here. This is the worst result right here. So we found that 25% of responses, so 1/4 of responses, could dissuade, impede, or prevent a user from exercising their right to vote. And that's a big thing to find. That's a big potential problem, right? And every chatbot gave multiple responses to this effect. So it is not to say like, we're gonna pick on OpenAI, or we're gonna pick on Anthropic. They all did this. And so I'll give you an example. Telling a voter with a disability what the voter registration deadline is. And it tells you the voter registration deadline is July 25th. And you want to register to vote on July 24th, but the voter registration deadline was actually July 5th, right? Well, now you're not registered to vote, right? Another example, and we got a lot sort of to this effect. There are certain types of voting for people with disabilities that are only available in certain states. So 13 states in the United States allow quote unquote print disabled voters, which is typically blind and low vision folks, to vote via the internet. The remainder of states in the United States do not allow internet voting. And if a chatbot says, yes, you can vote by internet here when you can't, that could dissuade someone from voting. We saw a similar thing with curbside voting. That is not allowed in every state. It is something that is often used by people with disabilities, including folks with mobility concerns. And again, if a chatbot says, yes, you can curbside vote here, particularly let's say if you're someone who moved to a different state and in your previous state, you were able to vote curbside. And in your new state, you're not. You ask ChatGPT and it says, yeah, go ahead. You show up to the polling place expecting to be able to do that. That could dissuade your ability to exercise your right to vote. This was the big one for me, right? Is like I was really interested in how could misinformation by these chatbots have a real life impact? And that number was much higher than I wanted it to be. This is also an interesting thing too, is that there are folks in the tech policy community in particular who say like, because the information from chatbots is sometimes wrong, like use it like Wikipedia, right? Like use it as a way to get other sources and to recommend authoritative forms of information. Don't use it itself as an authoritative form of information. Except the thing is, when we asked it to provide authoritative information, half of the answers were wrong. So it's actually not even good at that. And to be clear, the models have actually gotten a lot better, but we still sort of have these concerns. So here are some exact answers here. When asked to define curbside voting, Llama said that election officials are required to provide curbside voting upon request. That's literally not true. Curbside voting is only allowed or required in 27 states and the District of Columbia. So that's like half wrong, right? In like almost half of states in the United States, that's wrong. McStraw claimed that Texas voters could vote remotely using a ballot compliant with the Military Postal Voting Act. That's the fake law that it made up. And in response to a question asked from the perspective of a ward to a person with a disability under guardianship, ChatGPT said it's important to ensure that your ward understands that they have the right to vote regardless of disability. That's actually not true. In several states, folks who are under guardianship, depending on if they're under full guardianship or partial guardianship, do not in fact have the right to vote. And it is less concerning actually that a model would say that everyone has the right to vote than to say like actually you don't have the right to vote when someone does and prevent them from exercising that right. But it, as we titled it, it generates confusion. This is a very confusing thing to deal with. So what can we do about this? And I'm moving through this very quickly also, so I'm actually gonna leave, I think, like even longer for Q&A, which is gonna be fun. So what were our recommendations here? Don't use chatbots as primary sources of voting information, because they're not good at it, because voting is too important. Fact check your information, right? But if you're gonna go through the entire process of fact checking, you might as well just go to a better source to begin with, because it's gonna take you much longer. And so most of our recommendations in this report were towards developers, right, to like build a better tool, build a better system. And one of the things that we recommended was that developers, basically train their chatbots to direct users to authoritative sources of election-related information instead of trying to just provide stuff that's nonsense. We recommended that they proactively test models to answer questions to election queries like we did, right? Like, do this yourself before you unleash it upon the world. We recommend that they, developers prohibit conduct that interferes with elections, prohibit users from conducting demographic targeting and campaign activities, and disclose how recently the training data was updated. Because sometimes a question can be time sensitive, right? As an example, when's the voter registration deadline? And if your training data is old, it might just be giving you something that's outdated. But if it said, you know, PS, my training data was last updated a year ago or whatever it is, that may provide like an extra layer of caution for a user, such that a user might not necessarily take what is being said as truth, which would be better. So I use this again sort of as an example, right? And I use this one as an example because I had the most fun with it, but also because it is probably the most problematic as far as research results for most of the research that I have done in my time at CDT thus far. And I like to use chatbots as an example too, because it tends to be the thing within the context of AI that most people have proactively used on purpose. All those other things I was mentioning in the beginning, right? Things like hiring tools or tenant screening algorithms or healthcare algorithms, right? Those are things that you're probably interacting with, but you may not know about it, which can make it feel a little bit more difficult to concretize. Whereas people are using these, you're probably using them on purpose, whether you're incorporating them into your work and whether that's like whether you're using them in a way that is helpful to you at the end of the day are different questions. But I find that sort of elevating this as an example hopefully sparks some conversation about information integrity and misinformation. But outside of that, sort of as a general matter, right? Like what can we do? What can we do to ensure that people with disabilities are being centered in tech policy? What can we do to, again, going back to like building a disability inclusive AI ecosystem to maximize benefits and minimize risks? So we focus on inclusion. We prioritize accessibility, but think about accessibility not as a ceiling, right? We have to do better than a disabled person can use this. Thinking about and valuing intersectionality, so again, thinking about multiple marginalization, and being actively anti-ableist, right? In our design, in our procurement, in the deployment, in the auditing of these technologies, and with an understanding, and I mentioned this before, right? That AI is never neutral. Its integration into systems is never neutral. AI is also not bad. It's also not good, right? It is none of those things. Inherently, the technology is neither good nor bad. But what we need to be thinking about is how is it being incorporated into these systems? How are these systems already impacting marginalized people? And how can we sort of, if in fact we believe that integrating these tools makes sense, which we need to start there. I call that step 0, right? Which is like, is AI even the best way to solve this problem? People would do better if we asked that question, because sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the better way to solve a problem is with a much more difficult systems change, right? Or with hiring more teachers or something like that that feels hard, whereas the incorporation of an AI tool feels easier. But we need to sort of like have those conversations and think about what the integration of that tool is going to really look like and who is it going to impact. And not just sort of think about people with disabilities as folks who benefit from assistive tech without also thinking about folks with disabilities as a marginalized group that is being further marginalized by these tools in every aspect of life. So I am going to sort of turn it over to you. I think we have about 40 minutes, and I said 30, so that's even better.
Please, if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise their hands.
I have a question.
Sure.
My question.
Sorry.
It's okay. My question is, I would like to know about your interaction with either of the state agencies or the private agencies. I want to find out, like, in your approach to the leaders within these institutions, how have they responded to your organization? Meaning, is there any friction, resistance, openness, welcoming? And my other question is, like, what channels or processes have you used to, like, gather information from, say, the major, if you have interacted with, like, government bureaucracies, like, what processes have you used to, like, gather information from them regarding AI and disability issues?
Sure, yeah. So the first question is sort of when I'm interacting with agencies, how do they respond? The answer is that it depends on who you're talking to. I would say, as a general matter, disability is a bipartisan issue. It has been historically for a very long time. The Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. And disability in general has been something that's been bipartisan for a very long time. So as a general matter, I would say that I experience a fair amount of openness. Also, typically when I talk to folks, it is because they have sought me out. So there is some interest from the jump. I don't necessarily know that there is full buy-in into some of the things that I say, right? Like just how far-reaching this is, as an example. And some of the harms are easier to concretize than others, right? The harms on the hiring assessments, as an example, right? Where I point to the study that University of Washington did, or I point to the qualitative research that we did at my organization, where we found that they're called gamified assessments. They're like little computer games almost that are incorporated into the hiring process, and they look like little video games almost. And we found that they were fairly incompatible with screen readers, that they really only arguably measured anything related to jobs, and that folks with disabilities who interacted with them felt discriminated against by them, right? And so when you have like research, I think it's easier to concretize some of the harms. One of my favorite things about working with Damien actually is that Damien is someone who can like tell when a harm is coming before it's happened. And so we'll be talking to each other of like, this is going to happen. But when you talk about things that are in the future, it's easier to kind of be, I think, brushed off. And then it happens. And we're like, we literally told you that this was going to happen. And an example I'll give of something like that is the use of AI in doctors' offices. There are doctors' offices that are using AI tools basically to replace scribes. So like to take notes during your medical visits. And because getting information wrong and hallucinating is an inherent part of using an LLM, there were folks like Damien and like Ashley, who I think also said this to me early on, of like using this tool is gonna not be that helpful, right? Like it could be bad. And then, I think about a year and a half or 2 years later, the Associated Press came out with a piece saying that the tool Whisper that was being used in many, many doctors' offices throughout the country had hallucinated like in total over 1 million times or something ridiculous, right? And so the answer to that question of like sort of how is it perceived, it depends on who you're talking to. It depends on whether they've sought you out or not. I think disability in general still remains a bipartisan issue because it's something anyone can be impacted by. The interest level in the harms that feel far off depends also on how sort of future-reaching somebody is. And some of that also has to do with their inherent understanding of the technology, right? The reason Damien brought that to me years ago was because he understands how the tool works, right? And I remember having this conversation and being like, oh, you're so right. That's obviously going to happen. But it's hard to elevate that as a concern until you have proof, which is difficult because by the time you have proof, people have been harmed. And that's like not ideally what you want. The second question of being of like, how do I gather data from agencies? Every once in a while, an agency will be very transparent about their use of AI and sort of what their like how they are using it and at what level and what their intake looks like. So I have a colleague named Quinn who like is so good at keeping tabs on all of that. So I typically just sort of ask him what he's been keeping an eye on of which agencies. But other than that, like I have no insider information on how agencies are using AI other than what they put out publicly. But again, this is one of those things where like you could think how it could look in the future with an understanding of the tools and an understanding of the systems, right? And then you sort of wait and see. Other questions?
Thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I have two questions, actually. You talked a lot about expertise and mentioned that it's the lack of expertise in tech firms. It's one of the main problems why we have accessibility issues. So the first question is, who would an ideal expert, in your opinion, be? What are certain traits that would qualify someone as an expert to be hired in a tech firm to solve some of these problems? And my second question has to do with data. You mentioned that some of the key steps to take to produce better AI has to do with collecting better data. And you said that we need to collect data in all contexts. So I'm just wondering, since disability is such a broad spectrum, how would you do this in practice?
Sure. Okay, so the first question, what's the ideal expert? The ideal expert is someone who thinks about disability not just from a lens of accessibility, but in thinking about what other forms of discrimination look like. Tech companies hire accessibility people all the time, right? And the reason for that is a capitalist incentive, right? It's not because they care about us so much, right? It's because if a tech company wants to sell products, they understand that there are a lot of disabled people in the world, in the country, whatever their market is, right? And so the incentives, to a certain extent, line up insofar as a tech company wants me to use their thing or buy their thing or give my data to their thing so they can sell it. And I want to use the thing insofar as I want to use it, right? And so those incentives line up for tech companies to make accessible technology, which is why it's mind-blowing when they release stuff that's not bare minimum accessible, right? Because like, what do you mean Threads, which is owned by Meta? Again, Meta has had image descriptions on Instagram since like at least 2018. And they released Threads, I think in 2023 or something like that. And it didn't have an image description capability, right? Like, why are you releasing a tool that doesn't have image descriptions? I know you know how to do that, right? You literally have the capability for it. And that's just silly from an incentives perspective, from like a capitalist incentives perspective, because you built a product that some disabled people can't use. And so they're gonna use something different, right? And especially for something like Threads, where there are other alternatives, right? There are things like Blue Sky, right, as an example, which is not perfect on accessibility either, but like image descriptions are kind of basic stuff in this day and age. So like thinking about it as more than that though, right? As not just, okay, we have an incentive as a company to build a product that folks can use, but thinking about it more broadly as we have a social obligation, right, to each other, part of the social contract, to build tools that don't discriminate against people, right? And so that expert would ideally be somebody who thinks about disability in tech from the perspective of more than access, right? And that's a difficult thing in part because we're still fighting for access, right? Like we are still pushing for that the Title II rules, as an example, Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a rule that's supposed to be taking effect in about 3 weeks that would ensure that public entities, so things like voter districts, would have to have their websites be accessible, right? There's a real question mark as to whether or not that rule is actually going to take effect. we are still fighting for access, basic accessibility online, right? And so it's difficult, it's a tough sell to say like, actually that thing that we are still fighting for, that thing that we don't have, that's actually the bare minimum. And we need to think about much more than that. But that's what the ideal expert, I think, would have. To answer your question on data, what I said was we need to collect disability data in all areas where we're collecting other demographic data, right? And so it is very difficult to do that. One of the things that we wrote about in this report was thinking about places where folks with disabilities are disproportionately. So that can be hospitals or long-term care facilities or something like that. And how it may be very difficult to access people in those spaces. And how if you really want to build inclusive data, you should probably try to do it anyway, right? And thinking about not just sort of like that physical access, but when you are collecting data, are your questions in plain language so that a person with an intellectual or developmental disability would be able to access them? Let's say you're sending it in a Google form or something like that, like, is that accessible to screen readers, right? Like thinking about, and this is kind of what I mean, that like the accessibility of it is a part of it, but it's not even close to being all of it, right? The accessibility is the floor. The accessibility of, as a disabled person, can I even access this attempt to gather data from me, right? That's the bottom level. And then we think about the rest of it, which is, do I feel safe to give this information? Do I feel that it is sufficiently privacy protected? Have you come to where I am and met me so that I can even reach you? And that's thinking about access, not necessarily accessibility, right? And this pervasive idea of like, we are still fighting for accessibility, but there's actually a lot more happening. It goes throughout kind of all of these areas of work. And when I tell people I work at the intersection of disability rights and tech, people assume I'm a digital accessibility expert. I'm actually not. I don't know how to fix your website, right? Like, I have literally no idea. That is not my area of expertise. It's not that people shouldn't have that area of expertise. They should. But also we need to think more inclusively, more broadly about the effects that these things are having on our lives. Other questions?
Okay, thank you for your talk. So yeah, my question is about data again. So here we are talking about the importance to include this data from disabled people. But it came to my mind a discussion that we had in an earlier session about how actually if for example, the AI is capable to recognize some bodies or some persons, it could be dangerous. So what would be the recommendation in order to balance this recollection and training of the platforms and not to become a possible, how do I say it? A possible resource to more discrimination towards these people?
This is a really good question, right? This is one of those things that there's a really difficult balance, right? And you see this actually quite a lot, this idea of trade-offs. They're not uncommon in the intersection of disability and tech, right? So I'll give an example. I talked about internet voting earlier. Internet voting is an accessible form of voting for certain blind and low vision people where it is legal in 13 states in the United States. There are real cybersecurity concerns with internet voting. The question of trade-offs, right, of what it looks like to think about whether or not the accessibility benefit and the cybersecurity detriment even out is one that people struggle with a lot, right? On the work I do with assistive technology, right? A lot of assistive tools pose very significant privacy concerns. They're gathering information about your location and maybe your biometrics and all these things, right? And that doesn't mean that people with disabilities don't use them, but it does mean that sometimes we are trading off our privacy to use them. on this, kind of what I've always argued is that a lot of those trade-offs aren't necessary, that we can think about things like data minimization, right, which is only collecting the data that you absolutely need to make a thing work. That we can think about something called purpose limitation. Purpose limitation means the data that you collect, you're only using it for that purpose. You're not selling it to a third party. And the example I always give when I talk about purpose limitation is there was a nonprofit organization called Crisis Hotline. I'm sure you can think about what the Crisis Hotline was doing. And they basically got caught taking a bunch of information that they had gleaned in the course of their nonprofit functioning and using it to train a for-profit spin-off, basically customer relation management software, right? That's bad. Nobody wants that, right? And that's why purpose limitation, right? It's having a policy that says the information that I get, I'm only using it for the thing that I said I'm going to use it for. And data minimization, which says I'm only going to take what I absolutely need. And deletion, right? Which says like I'm going to take the information I need and then I'm going to delete it later, right? And thinking about informed consent, meaning you as a user know what data you're giving and what happens to it, right? Those things apply. They build a better data environment, a privacy protective environment when you're thinking about assistive technology. And that applies to your question about data too, right? Are we gathering data? And this is kind of what I mentioned earlier, right? This idea that like more data, feed it into the maw, right? And that's how you'll have better tools. Like to a certain extent, like yes, right? Just from an understanding of how these tools work. But that's not a net good for society, right? And so we need to think about not more data collection practices, but better data collection practices. And better data collection practices include being privacy protective and thinking about privacy, data minimization, purpose limitation, deletion, informed consent, right? As part of that initial process. Because that winds up, hopefully, striking that spot of we have built a better tool that has less discriminatory outcomes, but we've also mitigated the harms of having more data here, right? And that could also mean that there's certain types of data that we're just simply not collecting, right? There is no one that can demand or access information from you that you never collected to begin with. So if there's a third-party breach or a hack, right? Not even talking about regular data collection practices, but like something bad happens. A hacker or a third-party bad guy cannot access data from you as an organization, as a company, or whatever, that you never got to begin with, right? And that's also thinking about data minimization. Your question's a really good one in that we need to think about the trade-offs, right? And I don't know, it would be case dependent, right? That's a lawyer's favorite expression, it depends. It would be case dependent as to where the line is, as to like how what data we should collect, and at what point are we at the tipping point of like, this is most likely gonna be used for the bad thing, so let's not, right? But as a general matter, thinking about data governance, those principles, purpose limitation, data minimization, deletion, right? These are things that can help us have data, use it in responsible ways that create better tools while mitigating and minimizing some of those potential risks. But it's a really good question.
So Fernanda has a question in the chat. She says, thank you for the talk. Does CDT have resources to help PWD who are in the job market? Based on your research for hiring processes, do you have recommendations for PWD when searching for jobs or for colleagues when writing their letter of recommendations?
Yes, I'm happy to answer this. So we don't do very much sort of like direct employment assistance. The American Association of People with Disabilities does, and I would recommend checking out their website and their tech policy vertical on their website too. But what I will say is that CDT put out a report last year, and I've alluded to it. It's called Screened Out, and if you just Google Screened Out CDT, it'll come up. And we did include quite a bit of recommendations in there for people with disabilities and disability rights and justice advocates on how to interact. Thanks, Damien. How to sort of approach a hiring process with the understanding that you may in fact be interacting with a hiring tool. Right? So that report does include quite a bit of recommendations for folks with disabilities. And there is also the employment section of the Building a Disability Inclusive AI Ecosystem report that I wrote. That also includes some recommendations for folks with disabilities. The main recommendations, though, are really just to like raise your own awareness of it and raise the awareness of people in your community, right? Because that's the first thing that we can do, is to understand even going into it. Before I started doing this work, the employment thing really captured me for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is because if anyone has ever been in the position where you like need a job, right? You're probably just applying to a whole bunch of jobs. And if you don't get a job, for me, the last thing I ever would think of is like, it was probably the gamified assessment that accidentally flagged me as having a disability. I would just be like, okay, next, because I really need a job, right? And I don't think that people know that these things, as an example, that you did a Zoom interview and there was an algorithm running in the background that was judging your eye contact or your vocal cadence, right? That may have screened you out on the basis of something related to a disability. How would you possibly know that, right? And if you don't know, you can't ask for an accommodation on the back end, and there's no recourse on the other end either, right? And I was giving a talk once, actually, and I was asked, not asked, accused, I would say, sort of like your recommendations on like raising awareness around screening and hiring tools in particular. This is just because you're very litigious and you want to sue people. I am very litigious. I would love to sue people. But that's actually not the reason. The goal of raising awareness is because people with and without disabilities deserve to know when they're interacting with these tools. I genuinely believe that everyone deserves to know what their interactions with AI tools look like and also what the potential effects are. I believe very strongly in transparency as a regulatory requirement. We don't have that. So you could be interacting with these tools. These tools could be making decisions in large part about your life without you knowing. I don't think that that is right from a legal or a regulatory perspective, right? But it's not about being able to sue someone after the fact. It's about, the goal would be, just even outside the ethics of like deserving to know, the goal would be that you could ask for an accommodation on the back end and you could get the job that you're qualified for. And then everyone would be happy, right? It's not about like, I just love to sue people. Like, it's about building a better world for people with disabilities and allowing them to interact with these tools in ways that are accessible and non-discriminatory. So the answer to your question is that those reports do have recommendations on employment, but if you want sort of more tangible stuff that's sort of less focused on like awareness raising and organizing, AAPD has really good stuff, so I would definitely recommend checking them out.
Thank you. This is great. I actually wanted to pick up on this last point because I was thinking about this in response to Fernanda's question, which is very individualized, right? This idea of like what tools, what do we need to know in order to resist as individuals? But of course, the problems are, as you point out, systemic. So you right at the end of that, you mentioned, regulatory compliance. So I was just wondering, because I didn't actually hear a lot in here. I heard a lot of shoulds, like this should happen, that should happen, but I didn't actually hear very much about your engagement with the regulatory world. So I was just wondering what specific kinds of recommendations do you have for policy in this domain, and and there's different kinds of policies as well, right? There's regulatory policy that is really oriented toward these private companies, but then there's also policy towards governmental systems and the ways that those are structured and the ways that they incorporate or don't incorporate, although that latter seems to not really be an option.
Not the problem right
AI.
now.
So I was just wondering, like, just in a much more kind of direct and practical way, where you see opportunities for regulatory or other governmental or non-governmental sort of policy change.
Number one, federal privacy legislation. CDT has been fighting for federal privacy legislation for about as long as we've been around, which is 30 years. Federal privacy legislation, so a broad spanning privacy legislation. The United States does not have federal privacy legislation. We have HIPAA, which provides certain privacy protections in certain contexts, primarily the medical context, right? Anything that is not a HIPAA-covered entity, so what we refer to as a non-HIPAA-covered entity, doesn't get a HIPAA privacy protection. And we have FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which provides some privacy for PII, personally identifiable information, for students that are in schools, right? FERPA, again, it only applies in limited contexts and helps in limited scenarios, right? And FERPA is one of the statutes that I talk about that could be helpful in thinking about privacy risks of using AI to generate individualized education programs for students, right? So it's not to say that we have no privacy legislation. We have FERPA, we have HIPAA, but they are very limited, they're narrow in scope, and they are meant to address very specific privacy harms, right? We do not have the type of broad-spanning federal privacy legislation that would really be able to address a lot of the privacy harms of AI and algorithmic tools in a broad way. So we continue to push for federal privacy legislation. There was one that was introduced, my goodness, I can't remember now, I think 2024, and there has not been one since that has gotten legs that I know of, but that's something to push for federally in your communities too. Now sort of thinking about, again, sort of like less like this is the bill that I want, but thinking more about like what I would want in something I'd consider like good AI regulation, right? So one is that I'll say as a general matter, the policy landscape for AI is shifting away from the federal government and towards the states at this point. The federal government doesn't like that and has been trying to incorporate what they call an AI moratorium, which would prevent states from regulating AI for a period of time. The original one that was trying to go through reconciliation last year was, I believe, 10 years. 10 years, not for nothing, in the tech space is an entire lifetime. ChatGPT came to market in 2022, and it has grown exponentially since then, and so have all the other large language models that came up in response to it, right? And so the federal government wants to, this administration in particular, seems to want to prevent states from regulating AI. And we can have conversations about states' rights and what that looks like, right? But it has come up in many, many conversations. It first came up in reconciliation last year, that was, I believe, July of 2025, but they've attempted to put it in a few different bills. This is a problem in part because the federal government hasn't passed an AI bill, and they have had time to do it. They say they haven't, but they have. And even if they wanted to pass one, the question as to whether it would be broad spanning enough, as an example, to regulate something like the Elvis Act in Texas, which focuses on, because Nashville has a strong music scene, that focuses on like deepfakes, right? Versus a law that could impact some other form of AI, a hiring tool or hiring assessment, right? Could a federal bill be broad enough to do something like that? But also then secondarily, would it ever include the things that we think are important? Assessments on like rights impacting tools that sort of like, increase the threshold for use. Transparency requirements for auditing, pre and post deployment. So what that means is before you unleash a technology, but also after, right? That audits are required. The thing I always say about this is like, you wouldn't just hire someone and then say like, great, you're hired, bye, right? Like you give an employee a performance review, you should do that for an AI tool, right? You should continuously audit it, make sure it's working, and if it's not working, get rid of it, do something else, right? those sorts of things, of thinking about like high risk areas, right? Thinking about maybe healthcare as a high risk area, thinking about rights impacting, whose rights are being impacted, thinking about regulating AI in ways that center civil rights, but also on the sort of like the concrete, the transparency, the audits, those sorts of things. Would they make it into a bill federally? And also, would the bill be able to make sense? Would the bill define AI is actually the first question, right? Because a lot of times people talk about AI and we don't know what we're talking about. We're all on different pages. And you would never have a bill that aims to regulate transportation, and you have no idea if we're talking about a car, a plane, a train, or a boat, right? But what you see in the tech space is this idea that like we should regulate AI. It's like, okay, what are we talking about, right? And is there really a way to have a broad spanning federal bill that does all of that? And I'm not saying there is or that there isn't, right? Or maybe the answer is many small bills, right? But what I will say is that there's a lot of work happening on state level AI bills that aim to correct the things that are really important to state level constituencies. And I wrote about this last year, about thinking about the AI moratorium as a disability rights issue, right? Because some state level AI bills, they are addressing some of these harms that could impact people with disabilities. And the idea that states wouldn't be able to do that for their constituents because we are waiting on some mythical, magical federal AI bill that even in and of itself may not include, again, the things like mandating transparency and mandating pre and post deployment audits and considering use cases where maybe AI shouldn't be used and that sort of thing, where it may not even be there to begin with, is concerning. So from a concrete level, the landscape looks a lot like moving into states. And one of the more concrete things that we can do is to push for that, I think, to be allowed to continue. Not necessarily in the absence of continuing to advocate for federal bills, and certainly not in the absence of advocating with federal agencies. The Department of Justice is the department that enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? And I believe that there are arguments that the ADA applies to some algorithmic and AI-based harms. And so it's not an either or, but the idea that state level regulation should be allowed to continue, I think is something that we can all sort of think about as a very concrete policy recommendation. Anyone else? Questions?
Damien, do you have your hand up? Did you want to go? Oh, I don't think we can hear him. No. Yeah, we can't hear you.
I can see your face in 6 places again, though, yes. Damien. I think that this is how we should have. I think this is how we should have meetings. I don't want to have a meeting unless Damien's face is in 6 places.
Yeah. Not, I can ask in the chat.
Oh, I hear you
yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Hi,
Okay,
Damien.
okay. Hello, fantastic. I was gonna go ahead and put it in the chat, but since we can hear me now, like I said, having worked with Ariana, having worked with you for the past few years now, I am always kind of struck by the range of elements that you work on and the kind of the both breadth and depth of the kinds of things that you'll bring into this consideration space, thinking about policy, thinking about access. And so I guess my question right now for you is, if you had to choose 1 or 2 key issues that are like on your kind of horizon line that you think are going to be like crucially important in this area in the next year and a half, 2 years, things that we should really be like focusing our attention and our efforts towards, both in individuals, communities, but also in like policy space. What would you have in mind in that space?
This is a really hard question because it's all so bad. So I think that healthcare would be a big one for me. Oh, I don't like seeing myself in 6 places. Only Damien. It's okay. It's okay. Look, he's back. There you are, as it should be. I think healthcare is a big one. I think that for healthcare, the impacts of AI on healthcare are going to be really kind of broad-reaching, right? And there's a healthcare section of the Building a Disability Inclusive AI Ecosystem report too. So we're seeing sort of AI tools being used for diagnostics, which are scary. And part of the reason that that is scary is because for people like me with rare disease, if the data is not inclusive of rare disease, it's gonna misdiagnose you, and misdiagnoses can be fatal or next to fatal, and that's not good. So we're seeing AI being used in diagnostics. We already know it's bad at rare disease. It's gonna give you the thing that's like most common or most likely. We're seeing AI being used in treatment decision making. The New York Times, and I cited this article in the Building a Disability Inclusive AI Ecosystem report. New York Times put out a really good piece a couple years ago about opioid use algorithms. That physicians are concerned about prescribing opioids to people, potentially with good reason, right? And so they are outsourcing that decision making to an algorithm. And not only is it the regular sort of automation bias that you see, but there's a real concern about liability of like, if I decided to go against the algorithm and then a bad thing happened, what would happen? You see the similar thing in the criminal legal system on pretrial detention too, but that's a different conversation. So you're seeing it in diagnostics, you're seeing it in treatment, you're seeing it in insurance determinations, right? Who's deciding whether my medication is covered or not? Who's handling the appeal process? What's the role that an AI tool is playing in that, right? We're just seeing AI tools being incorporated into every aspect of healthcare. And that's not even sort of inclusive of like surveillance tools that these developers argue can increase the patient to nurse or doctor ratio significantly, which my concern has always been like, as anyone has spent a good amount of time in a hospital knows that like bad things can actually happen to multiple people at once. Like there's no rule that says that it can't. And when you use a surveillance tool or like for patient monitoring or something like that, bad things can still happen. So I think healthcare is a big one because it's being integrated sort of at every step. The other one I would say, honestly, is probably employment. Employment is our path towards mobility, social mobility, towards economic security. It is the thing that allows a lot of people with disabilities to live independently, to live self-directed lives, right? And when we are we've made significant progress on disabled employment, but we're seeing that progress potentially really sort of narrow and winnow. And it's not about employment numbers. It's about what employment numbers mean for marginalized people and for disabled people. And so I would say that those two are the biggest, but I'm also deeply concerned about benefits and Social Security Administration, HCBS, LTSS. You could think about that as being related to healthcare or not. I'm deeply concerned about voting and what things, what just even basic things like website accessibility. CDT is doing some work right now on elections websites and their accessibility in advance of what was going to be the Title II deadline. And I would say I worry a lot about education again, because education is just that idea of social mobility, right? That if we can build an educational environment where disabled kids can get degrees, we can also sort of build a life towards independent living. So my top two, I would say healthcare and employment. public benefits is really, really close. Voting is close, and then I would say education. But one of the interesting things about working in disability that I'll say too is that like everyone in disability is kind of expected to be a policy generalist, because the thought in policy is that like disability policy is its own thing, which means you have to know about disability in every context, which is a little bit different than like how a lot of other sort of like topics-based policy works, where like I'm a transit expert and I'm a health policy expert, and they're like, and you disabled people. And it's like, okay, but that's like everything. And so I call myself a disability policy generalist, but like to a certain extent we all are. And the tech side just adds a different lens to it. But a very good question, and I think our last one, right?
Well, so yeah, with that, let's give Ariana another round of applause. So today we, if you all are able to come, we will be going to Rising Silo around 6. And then next week is our McNabb lecture. So yeah, please come for that. We have Debolina Roy joining us. So thank you all again, and see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.